Saturday Night Live, initially titled NBC's Saturday Night, was a completely novel, youth-focused phenomenon when it first began airing in 1975, which is ironic considering its essence is distilled from a very old and very staid format, the variety hour. These have been around since the days of radio and were themselves just descendants of village fates and talent shows. Let's all get together and put on a show. But SNL was the first of these on television to be written by and aimed squarely at the youth. Even Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, successful as it had been less than a decade before Saturday Night Live, was talking about what the young people were up to, not to them. It had been successful more because parents laughed at the hippie jokes than because of any genuine affection from kids, many of whom rightly found it pandering. The brilliance of Lorne Michaels' idea was to realize that he could transplant the comedy of a new generation from nightclubs into this familiar, older format which worked on live TV, but only if it aired at the right time of night. Airing after 10 p.m. would allow the show to speak directly to that generation in their language and on their topics without being filtered and toned down by the network as much as Laugh-In had been. The trick would be to convince a network that the audience would come to them if the show aired late on a Saturday night when young people were supposedly out doing young people things and too busy for TV. The connection to earlier variety shows is keenly felt when I watch these earliest episodes from the first season, the first 3 shows particularly. They seem especially unfocused and rely far too much on the solo contributions of the host and guests. By the 4th episode, hosted by Candice Bergen, they'd begun to nail down the format and work on the voice that the show would stick with through the first 5 seasons, and place a greater emphasis on the featured players. Throughout year 1, you'll see several ideas that were tried and didn't work out. Most of what they would change the first year moved them farther away from the template followed by the earlier variety shows like the Carol Burnett Show and Laugh-In, and I believe the show was better for it. With that being said, this first episode of SNL is positively bursting at the seams with fresh ideas and manic energy, to the point it honestly feels overstuffed. Host George Carlin essentially does 3 monologues, there are 2 musical guests and 2 comic guests, as well as a sketch with Jim Henson's Muppets, and a film by Albert Brooks. With all this crammed into 90 minutes with commercial breaks, it's no wonder the not ready for primetime players appeared very little. Other than Chevy Chase, there would be only 4 live sketches featuring them, and only 1 featuring the whole ensemble. In the earliest days of planning for the show, Lorne's idea had been to have a rotating set of 3 or 4 guest hosts, and George Carlin had been on the list of potentials along with Lily Tomlin and Richard Pryor. That idea had long since been abandoned by the time the first show aired, but Carlin and the others were still committed to host 1 show each. George Carlin was not in a particularly good place in October of 1975. 2 months prior, his wife Brenda had had an alcohol-fueled breakdown that had shaken our family up. They had to force Carlin's toxic mother to stop living with him so Brenda could get sober, and the whole situation had led George to some reevaluation of his own substance abuse. At least while at home, Carlin had tried to abstain for his wife's benefit, but on the road and with the stress of hosting SNL, he allowed himself to relapse and began using cocaine heavily the week of the show. In his autobiography, Carlin says he doesn't remember, but has been told he locked himself in a hotel and wouldn't come out that week, causing them to break down the door. In any event, as a Carlin fan, it's pretty clear to me the man wasn't fully present that night. His normally pinpoint-accurate delivery is sloppier, he touches his face and fidgets uncomfortably, and his timing seems rushed. There had been skits written with the intention of featuring Carlin, but they were scrapped early on when he made it clear he was uncomfortable acting on live TV. He at least agreed to bring new material to the show, but in the end, Carlin couldn't even manage that. All of his jokes had been told before in clubs, and some had even appeared on albums. All of that is to say that, old or new material, Carlin is not really at his best here. The highlight is probably the final segment on God, which is at least mildly salacious enough to receive a complaint from someone claiming to be a cardinal. There's so much else to see in this show, however, that his shaky performance doesn't really bring the episode down much. Singer, keyboardist, and so-called fifth Beatle, Billy Preston was one of 2 musical guests on the first episode of Saturday Night Live, both of whom performed 2 songs. Preston's first song of the evening, Nothing from Nothing, had been a #1 hit for him in late 1974. The second, Fancy Lady, from his then-current album It's My Pleasure, was written and performed with Syreeta Wright, who is the most spellbinding and least bra-wearing person in this entire episode, no contest. It's well known that Lorne badly wanted to have the Beatles reunite on Saturday Night Live. Perhaps this was his first small step, or perhaps Stevie Wonder wasn't available, as rumor has it. Janis Ian is a New York folkie best known for writing serious and thoughtful songs about subjects like forbidden interracial romance and teenage angst. So, of course, let's book her on the first episode of our comedy variety series, Lorne must have thought. Actually, what he really thought was Carole King lives in LA, so this is the next best thing. I'm actually a big fan of Ian, but both of her performances are disjointedly scheduled after silly comedy sketches, and I personally think she made for a strange choice for the spot. I have a hard time thinking of anything less appropriate after Andy Kaufman singing Mighty Mouse and Carlin's Blue Food routine than a song like At 17. But Ian performs that number and the similarly somber In the Winter from her album Between the Lines. Andy Kaufman was not a complete unknown when he appeared on SNL. He'd been performing his foreign-man character for some time in comedy clubs and on the Van Dyke and Company variety show. However, it was his appearances on Saturday Night Live that would make him nationally recognized and help land him his best-known role as Latka Gravis on Taxi. In this legendary sketch, Andy walks out and meekly places the needle on a record. The theme to the cartoon Mighty Mouse plays, and Andy waits sheepishly until Mighty Mouse himself sings, "Here I come," which Andy mimes triumphantly before returning to rest. That's pretty much the whole bit, but by simply subverting the audience's expectations, Kaufman made this a moment of transcendent entertainment. You can feel the audience's joy when he starts singing and then stops again, and their anticipation as they wait for him the second time. It's just wonderful, a moment of pure TV magic. Did you know that Billy Crystal was originally scheduled to appear on this, the first SNL episode? It's true, and there's juicy behind-the-scenes happenings. According to Billy's interview in Live from New York by Miller Shales, Billy had been approached by Lauren to be a resident in the company and to be one of those earlier mentioned rotating hosts after a year or two. Apparently, Billy turned down a big special with Bill Cosby in order to appear on SNL, only to be told after dress rehearsal on Friday that he'd have to cut his piece down from 5 minutes to 2, and also that it would be the very last thing to air at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. After getting this news, Crystal's manager decided to pull him from the show rather than compromise on his client's big break. You know whose manager didn't do that? Valerie Bromfield, and I've determined that's why her piece turned out so god-awful it practically ended her career before it started. Bromfield was a troupe mate of Dan Aykroyd and Gilda Radner at Second City in Toronto and had been in consideration to become a member of the featured players. She didn't get the role, but was offered an appearance on the first show as a gesture of goodwill and also, frankly, as an insurance policy in case Lauren was short on material and needed to fill time. In hindsight, it seems pretty obvious Lauren overbooked the first few shows in case something went wrong or somebody canceled at the last minute, which means cuts like this were bound to happen. Bromfield had to make the same cuts Crystal was asked to make, and so her character piece suffers from an extreme lack of, well, coherent or funny things happening in it. She starts by telling us she's not, in fact, a comedian, but a school teacher, before launching into an admittedly good comedy portrayal of a stuffy preparatory instructor. This goes on for a bit before she disjointedly cuts to a ditzy cheerleader for a while, and then it's over. I imagine it had entire pieces of connective fabric yanked out in order to make the time constraint, and what's left of it just doesn't hold up. Perhaps if she'd been allowed the full time she'd been promised, she'd have made a better impression. Bill Crystal would be back later in the season, ostensibly to do the bit that got cut from this episode. Without spoiling anything, let's just say that being allowed to go on for much longer than Bromfield didn't help Crystal's skit be any less cringeworthy. In the first of 9 films Albert Brooks would make for the show, Brooks narrates in the style of an old newsreel various impossible stories from around the world. A blind cabbie who still drives fares around New York City, a literal land swap agreement which would see the U.S. state of Georgia and Israel switch places, and a rather tasteless item about Oregon lowering the age of consent from 18 to 7, accompanied by footage of an advertising exec hitting on a little girl who, when presented with his business card, replies, "I can't read yet."
Although the impossible truth airs what it must, some things it airs disgusts it.
Brooks's films were intended to provide downtime for costume changes and striking sets in between live sketches or music performances, but proved to be a point of contention. They frequently went over time and reportedly over budget, and midway through the first season, he and Lauren would mutually decide to end the arrangement. The idea for Weekend Update was something Chevy Chase and Lorne Michaels came up with early on in planning for the show, and Chevy performed the newscaster role at the very first screen test the ensemble ever recorded. He would become synonymous with Update the first season, with the other cast members and occasionally the host contributing editorials and advertisements. Chevy and Lorne realized early on that performing the show live on Saturday meant they could hone newscast-style material over the course of the week, adding details and indeed entirely new happenings as needed, even up to Saturday afternoon. Famously, after news broke late one Friday evening that the animal who'd portrayed Mr. Ed had passed away, there was a mad dash to get a horse to play a bereaved Mrs. Ed for Update. A note on my coverage of Update for these videos. I'll be honest with you here. Weekend Update is probably the least funny thing to watch in these old episodes because of the topicality of the humor. I think I know more about 1970s pop culture and politics than most folks born in the 1980s, but I have to look up why most of these gags are supposed to be funny. With that being the case, at least until we reach an era where I can speak firsthand about my memories of the news of the day, I'm going to keep my notes on Update to things that I have a hope you'll find interesting or funny, and not bore you with jokes about people running in the Democratic primaries against Jimmy Carter. A few random facts about the first Weekend Update. The very first joke is about Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. That should date the show pretty thoroughly if anybody's watching this, say, 50 years later on the internet. Right off the bat, Gerald Ford is portrayed as a clueless and out-of-touch dolt. Chevy would, of course, become well known for his non-impression of Ford, played with no effort to mimic the president's mannerisms or speech, but merely as a clumsy buffoon. This, though, was the first time we'd see that politics was very much inbounds as a topic for ridicule on SNL. Lastly, we have the first of many Lorraine Newman appearances as a stereotypical on-the-scene TV personality, reporting from a grisly murder at the Blaine Hotel. She nails the voice, by the way. After the fake commercial parody, a message informs us,
guests on NBC Saturday night stay at the fabulous Blaine Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. The Blaine, a tradition for more than half a century.
Which is pretty funny. For what it's worth, writer Michael O'Donoghue speaks the first word on SNL, a simple good evening to John Belushi's character. What follows is an interesting twist on an old joke, livened up by some bizarre dialogue of the type for which O'Donoghue would become known. Belushi plays an immigrant learning English from teacher O'Donoghue, who seems to relish feeding threateningly insane sentences for the hapless man to parrot back. O'Donoghue then has a heart attack, which Belushi dutifully feigns and falls to the floor. Then Chevy Chase wanders out dressed as a stagehand, trips, and in a very scripted TV kind of way delivers the soon-to-be famous line,
live from New York, it's Saturday night!
In a 1989 interview with People magazine, Michael O'Donoghue explained how he felt that night. I did the first line on the show. I was terrified. If I close my eyes, I can see that moment as they were counting off, 30 seconds, 15 seconds, as if a roller coaster is just at the top of the big hill and hasn't quite been caught up by gravity and gone screaming into the valley yet. I had that feeling when time stops and a big yawning abyss is below me. Dan Aykroyd makes an extremely brief appearance as Old Dad, who is immediately befallen by some unspecified disaster and is replaced by Chevy Chase through the magic of breakthrough product New Dad Insurance. This is the first piece of pre-taped material on SNL, something the show has always used to provide necessary downtime to accommodate the live elements of the show. During the first season especially, many of these pieces would be reused as needed whenever the show was short on time or a particularly complicated set or costume change had to be accounted for. Trial. A rather straightforward affair, unlike the other sketches in the episode. This ensemble piece is essentially just a long setup for one silly gag at the end. Jane Curtin is a young woman on the witness stand who's too embarrassed to repeat the vulgar language a man used while accosting her in an alleyway. I know, great setup for a sketch, right? The judge has Jane write down what the man said to her, which is passed around to the lawyers, judge, and jury, all of whom make shocked faces. Finally, juror Belushi passes the paper to a sleeping juror played by Gilda Radner, who mistakes the note for a proposition and gives a big thumbs up. Of note, the judge was played by character actor George Carlin, who initially was slated to perform supporting roles calling for older men. This is the only episode in which he is credited as a member of the cast, but he would later occasionally appear in episodes until the decision was made to simply use a member of the ensemble in makeup for such characters. The first of many, many talk show host appearances by Jane Curtin, in which she interviews alleged shark bite victim Belushi, who has rather obviously not been shark bitten and is faking his missing limbs. This and Wolverines are Belushi's star turns for the episode, but he wouldn't get much more quality screen time until the end of episode 3. A rather groundbreaking piece in some respects, but also sort of cringeworthy in that it depicts a married gay couple on television in 1976, but also seems to make them the butt of some strange joke. This is a rather straightforward, almost word-for-word parody of them current advertisements for Geritol, but with the hilarious twist that the wife who's being force-fed the stuff is a dude. On a side note, it's hard to imagine two people with such differing levels of on-camera charisma as 1970s-era golden boy Chevy Chase and Michael O'Donoghue, who nearly always looks like some sort of Gollum by comparison. Though they were both technically hired as writers, Chase would go on to become the well-known face of the show in its first season, whereas Michael O'Donoghue would appear on camera less and less. A parody of long-running soap opera General Hospital, which even in 1976 had already been running for 13 years. This utterly silly sketch is the only one in the episode to feature the entire cast of not ready for primetime players. All of the male bees are pacing around the waiting area of the hospital, waiting for the nurse to arrive with news of their young baby bees. We have baby drones for Aykroyd and Morris, then a worker bee for Belushi, then a special sneak preview of next week's episode where Chase learns he's the father of a queen. That's the joke. I already don't care for the bees, which must be why they kept bringing them back over and over and over again all season. SNL can be hard-headed like that sometimes. Gilda Radner's big introduction came in this rather pedestrian send-up of the sorts of trade schools you used to see advertised on weekend television. It's cute, but honestly just one of a long, long line of commercial parodies that would become instantly unfunny the moment the ad campaigns they were intended to parody went away. I honestly can't imagine anybody writing a piece like Show Us Your Guns today, let alone filming it in this style and airing it on national television. I can't say I understand the point of the whole affair, but it is at least funny to watch this old lady waving a pistol around. Aykroyd gets his star turn of the night as an, dangerous burglar or home security salesman. It's not a great look to make your second appearance on stage after B as an armed intruder, but Danny pulls it off as well as anybody could. He and his associate, Garrett Morris with a machine gun, pressure Belushi and Gilda into buying an expensive alarm system at gunpoint. This one is a good example of the early style of slash and burn comedy, where harsh and cruel behavior was used for shock value and laughs. It can be done well, or it can just come off as harsh and cruel. This particular skit is decent, but the show, and O'Donoghue in particular, often got criticism for being misogynist just for the hell of it. The final commercial parody of the evening is for a product so absolutely absurd that surely it could never exist, and even if it did, nobody would be dumb enough to buy it. Can you even imagine a razor with 3 blades? Listen, we got about half the season to talk about how terrible the effing Muppets were on SNL, and this video is already lengthy, so I'm gonna save them for episode 2. Just know that they only started being mildly entertaining after they'd already been kicked off the program but kept showing up begging for their jobs back, and we'll get to them in due time. There's also a short promo for next week's show where Paul Simon teases a reunion with his ex-partner, Art Garfunkel. No hard feelings on Paul. It's a real odd duck of an episode though, so tune in next week.